Teasley here. Today we're going to talk about solving quadratic equations. All right, a quadratic equation is in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So the way that you know you're dealing with a quadratic is you're going to see that x squared variable pop up somewhere in the equation. That also means that you're going to have two solutions. So that x squared means that for the most part, you're going to have two solutions as your final answer. All right, so in this lesson, we're going to learn how to solve different types. Well, we're going to learn how to solve quadratic equations using different types of methods. All right, the first method we'll be using is the factoring, the zero factor property. So we'll be factoring again. All right, so we'll talk about how that works. So here for the first example, first thing is you want to make sure everything is set equal to 0, which in this case it is. So next step we're going to do, we're going to factor. All right, when we factor this, we got our two parentheses. X squared breaks down as x times x. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply and give me positive 6, but add and give me negative 5. So in that case, that would be a negative 3 and negative 2. All right, so factoring, we've done factoring a lot. So that's the factoring part. The solving to get the final answer, we're going to take both parentheses or both factors and set it equal to 0. That's what that zero factor property is stating above. So to finish this problem off, I'm going to add 3 to both sides. X equals 3. Add 2 to both sides here. And x equals 2. So those are your two final answers. So again, quadratic, x squared, 2 answers. All right, for example 2, in order for me to solve this, I have to multiply this stuff out and set everything equal to 0, right, before I can do any factoring. So I'm going to distribute. This becomes 3x squared minus 6x equals, distribute this 4 to that parentheses. This is 4x plus 4, and then you have that plus 4 at the end behind it. I'm going to combine like terms. So 3x squared minus 6x equals 4x plus 8. At this step, you want to get everything set equal to 0. So first thing I'm going to do is, since I already have my x squared on one side of the equation, I'm going to try that 3x squared, I'm trying to get everything on that side. So first thing I'm going to want to subtract 4x from both sides. That's 3x squared minus 10x equals 8. So I still have that 8 over there. I need to move that 8 over also. So I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. And when I do that, I get 3x squared minus 10x minus 8 equals 0. At this point, I need to factor and solve. I encourage you at any time during this video to pause the video and stop and try some of these problems on your own before proceeding with the video, so you can check your answer. So at this point, I will probably stop, pause, and factor this and solve it. All right, so remember, in order to solve problems like this, we're going to have to use that slide and divide method. So that 3 that's in front of that x squared, I'm going to move it across the page beside the 8 and multiply it. So that gives me x squared minus 10x minus 24 equals 0. When I factor this, I have x and x. Looking for two numbers that multiply and give me negative 24. But when I add them together, I get a negative 10. So that would be negative 12 and positive 2. But remember, the number that you multiply by in the beginning, you have to come back and divide by it. So I'm going to divide both numbers by 3. And when I do that, I get x minus 4. Remember, the 3 that's underneath this 2, you will bring it and bump it right in front of that x in that parentheses. So that's 3x plus 2 equals 0. All right, so that's the factored form of that answer. And then the final step would be to set both parentheses equal to 0. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides here. X equals 4. I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. 3x equals negative 2. Divide both sides by 3. And I get x equals negative 2 over 3. So those would be your two answers for x. All right. So that might be a good problem to just stop, pause, and try to do it on your own for practice. All right, the next method we're going to use is to solve a quadratic equation by using the square root property. And that's if you have problems in this form. If you just see x squared and then you see a constant or any number, a stands for any number. If you see x squared and any number, then you'll want to use this square root method. So basically you wouldn't have an x term in your problem. So if you look at example 3, I have 3x squared plus 4 equals 58. There's no x in the problem. Only thing I see is x squares and numbers. So what I want to do is I want to isolate the x squared. So that's our goal, is to isolate x squared, which means you want to get it by itself. So I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides first. That leaves me with 3x squared equals 54. To get x squared by itself, I'm going to have to divide both sides by 3. And when I do that, x squared equals, let's see, 3 goes into 5 one time with 2 left over. 3 goes into 24 8 times. So that's 18. So this is x squared. This number represents x being squared. We want to know the value for x. So to undo a square right here, you have to take the square root of both sides. And remember, you should have 2 answers. So in order for us to get the 2 answers, we include this plus or minus symbol. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 18. We need to simplify this radical. So if you look on your square root chart, 18 is the same thing as the square root of 9 times the square root of 2. So this is plus or minus 3 square root of 2. So in my math lab, there should be a plus or minus symbol, and you can put your answer in just like this. If not, your final answer would be x equals 3 square root of 2, comma, negative 3 square root of 2. So you would have to write a separate. So either or would be fine. All right. Same thing goes for this next example here. You only see an x. Yes, that parentheses is being squared. Your goal when you solve an equation is to get x by itself. So there's no need to try to multiply this stuff out and then set it equal to 0 and factor. If you see a problem in this form, you want to use the square root property. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Anytime you introduce a square root into the problem, you need to put a plus or minus symbol in front. So that plus or minus symbol. The square and the square root cancel, so this is x minus 3 equals plus or minus square root of 4. So x minus 3 equals plus or minus 2. When you get to this point, you break it off into 2 separate equations. So basically what you have is x minus 3 equals positive 2, or x minus 3 equals negative 2. These are the 2 solutions that you have. X could be either or. All right, but you're going to list both as your final answer. So now to solve this, we're going to add 3 to both sides. So x equals 5. Add 3 to both sides here. And I get x equals 1. So in my math lab, in that box, you're going to enter 5, 1. Those would be the 2 solutions that you would put into my math lab. All right, at this point, I will stop, pause, and try this example. So maybe pause the video and try to work this example out. This example is going to include what we talked about last class also. All right, so here I see This problem is squared. I want to get x by itself. Here's my x. All right, but in order for me to get x by itself, I have to get rid of that square on the outside of the parentheses. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. But remember, anytime you take square root, you have to put a plus or minus symbol in front of it. So this becomes, whenever I take the square root of something squared, they cancel each other out. So this is 2x minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 5. Remember, anytime you see a negative underneath the square root, you break that apart as negative 1 times the square root of 5. We know that the square root of negative 1 is I. So 2x minus 1 equals plus or minus I square root of 5. The correct way to write it is to put the I behind it. But I just wanted you to see that that square root of negative 1 actually equals I. So I have 2x minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 5. The I is behind the square root, not underneath, but behind it. And at this point, you want to set this equal to two different equations. You want to set apart two different equations. 2x minus 1 equals positive square root of 5i, or 2x minus 1 equals negative square root of 5i. Your goal is to get x by itself, so I'm going to add 1 to both sides. So this is 2x. So what we do is with this 1, we put it right in front of this square root. Remember, this is the positive square root of 5. So this is going to be 1 plus square root of 5i. So we stick that 1 right in front of it. All right, but you're adding it, so you have to put that plus in between. And then the last step is to divide by 2. So you just draw a fraction bar, but for imaginary I stuff, you can't share a denominator, so I'm going to divide both by 2, just like that. So your final answer is x equals 1/2 plus the square root of 5i over 2. All right, that's how that first answer will go in. And then the next one, I'm going to add 1 to both sides. So put 1 right in front of that negative square root of 5i. So 2x equals 1 minus square root of 5i. To get x by itself, divide both sides by 2. You would divide each individual term by 2 over here on the left side. So x equals 1 over 2 minus the square root of 5 over 2. And the I goes beside the fraction or at the top of the fraction. Either or is fine. So if you notice here, I put the I right beside the square root of 5, which is fine. My math lab shouldn't mark it wrong, but the correct way of writing is in this a plus bi form. So the I would be technically beside the fraction. So here are both of your answers. So in my math lab, this is how you will have to type it in. They will give you the x equals. You will write 1/2 plus square root of 5 over 2i, comma. This is plus. All right, the other one would be 1/2 minus the square root of 5 over 2i. All right. So that one was, that one included some imaginary stuff. So, alrighty. All right, now we're going to move on to the quadratic formula. All right, so anytime you see a problem where it says solve using a quadratic formula or completing the square. So the direction says solve by completing the square. We're going to use this formula also. And the reason why is because this formula is derived by using a process called completing the square. So they take this generic quadratic equation, they apply the completing the square method, and then bam, they have this formula. So A, B, and C are all the numbers in your equation, and you have this nice formula you can put it into just to get your final answer. So if you don't want to do factoring, you can use this quadratic formula to help solve your problem. I will only use quadratic formula if they tell you to use it, and like if you have to use it. You always want to try to factor first. But in the directions, it's telling us to use the quadratic formula. So in order for me to use the quadratic formula, I have to figure out the values of A, B, and C. So the values of A, B, and C, A is whatever is in front of x squared, which is 3. B is whatever's in front of x, which is -5. And C would be the number without a variable, which is -2. Now you only can use the quadratic formula if everything is set equal to 0. So if it's not set equal to 0, you have to set up the problem in that way, all right, that everything is set equal to 0 before you can use a quadratic formula. So again, the quadratic formula says to find x, you take the opposite of b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So I'm going to plug all the numbers into this formula, simplify, and that will give you my final answers. So this is opposite of negative b. So there's a minus already in the formula. When you put down your b value, your b is -5. So the minus comes from here, and then your b value is -5. So it's plus or minus square root. B is -5, so I have to put -5 in parentheses squared. So make sure you put parentheses around that. Minus is part of the formula. The 4 is part of the formula. A is 3. Oh, try to color code it. So 4. A is 3. And C is -2. All over 2 times A. A is 3. So everything I put in pink is what I put into this formula. All right, the formula. So make this purple because that was part of the formula. So the only thing I had to plug in was the pink stuff. So simplifying this becomes +5 plus or minus the square root 25 minus 4 times 3 times -2. With 2 negatives becomes a positive. 4 times 3 is 12, and 12 times 2 is 24, all over 6. So this is 5 plus or minus the square root of 49 over 6, which becomes 5 plus or minus the square root of 49 is 7 over 6. All right, so since that 7, there's no more square root, I have to now separate this to get your final answers for x. Now remember, all this is x. This is what x equals. So to get your answer for x equals 5 plus 7 over 6, or x equals 5 minus 7 over 6. So when you get down to this step where you have that plus or minus left in the middle, you will separate it. And when you simplify it, 5 plus 7 is 12. 12 over 6 is 2. Here, this is -2 over 6, which is -1 over 3. Those are your two answers for x. X equals 2, comma, -1 over 3. Since I got two rational numbers, two nice round numbers, that lets you know that I really could have I could have used factoring to solve this problem. All right, factoring probably would have been the best method. All right, but they asked us to use quadratic formula, so we use the formula. All right, this will be one that I will tell you to pause the video and to try. So just pause your video, see if you can try this problem, and then we'll come back together and work it out. All right. So here, I'm going to use the quadratic formula. I have to get all my values for A, B, and C. A equals 1, B equals -3, and C equals -7. So remember, the quadratic formula is opposite of B plus or minus square root B squared minus 4AC, one big fraction bar all over 2 times A. So this is -3 plus or minus square root. Make sure you put that B in parentheses. That's -3 squared minus 4 times 1 times -7 all over 2 times 1. So opposite of -3 is +3 plus or minus square root. -3 squared is 9 This negative and that negative becomes a plus. 4 times 1 is 4, times 7 is 28, all over 2. And actually, yeah, so 9 plus 28. So this is 3 plus or minus the square root of 37, all over 2. And because you have that square root of 37, there's nothing that you could do. You don't have to split this apart. This should be good enough to put into my math lab because there should be a plus or minus symbol. If not, you will have to break it apart and do 3 plus the square root of 37 all over 2. And 3 minus the square root of 37 all over 2. All right, so let me just double check it. Okay. Alrighty, trying to see. All right, yeah, we're gonna stop there for tonight. So we're gonna stop just at quadratics, and we'll pick up the other types of equations when we meet again in class. All right, that's it.